Aloha mai kako. You are watching Hawaii Political Reporter.
Welcome back to New World Next Week. I'm James Corbett of CorbettReport.com.
And I'm James Evan Pilato of MediaMonarchy.com. James, let's begin just like we did last week with the latest round of the greatest emotional con game going, the one where every 4, 6, or 8 years the Democrats and Republicrats switch places. It's funny how that happens. So, James, let's look at U.S. midterm selection fallout, and let's start with the good. Marijuana legalization passes in Oregon and Washington, D.C. as well. James, we knew this was going to come someday, and it probably hasn't sunk into me yet, but it's only right and fair and true and natural that people not be locked up for using a plant. And perhaps the best part, which I didn't really know because no one's really talking about it, this measure, it was Measure 91 here in Oregon, also permits Oregon farmers to grow industrial hemp, which can be used to make food, oil, cloth, rope, and on and on and on. So that's definitely an even better upside to, of course, the easy thing of saying, oh, yeah, everybody gets to smoke pot. But if we can actually make products, then we're actually affecting real change in the real world. So the other side, James, the Oregon GMO food labeling ballot measure 92 appears to not pass. And this is what we led last week's New World Next Week episode on. And as we discussed last week, this was the most expensive ballot measure in Oregon history, with 100% of the no funding coming from out-of-state multinational corporations like Monsanto, Dow, Coke, and Kraft. But as I talk to you right now, there are still some maybe 13,000 votes yet to count, and even my county here, Multnomah County, has scored an extra 20-some thousand yes votes just in the last few hours, meaning the votes still to be counted are coming from the most likely to be voting yes areas, so it could, maybe, hopefully squeak by, but we'll see. Another interesting note is that a lot of sort of progressive ballot measures around the country sort of offer the counter to the fake conservatives taking over. And an interesting couple of notes from my home state of West Virginia: as the GOP picks up the Senate, Shelley Moore Capito becomes the first GOP senator from West Virginia in nearly 50 years and the first female senator in West Virginia history. Alongside that, 18-year-old Sarah Blair easily wins election to the West Virginia House of Delegates. She's now the youngest delegate in West Virginia history and currently the youngest lawmaker in America. Another couple of interesting notes, James, that were running down the selection updates. Cocaine was found on a ship owned by he's now the majority leader, Mitch McConnell's father-in-law. No one's talked about that. And an interesting bit from our man Brock West: 1.8 million voters are dead, and other facts you didn't know about vote fraud. James?
Well, some interesting stories there, so I hope people will go through the show notes and check them out. But, I mean, do I really have to go through my take on elections in general? I'm sure people will know by now, but of course there's always new people tuning in. So yes, it is fork versus spoon, red versus blue, left versus right. It is a mostly meaningless charade in a lot of different ways. So I don't know. I mean, I'm not exactly excited about this. I don't really care either way. It's just a different face of the same ruling party. So off with one hat, on with the other. Don't blame me. I voted for Kodos. Well, having said that, though, I mean, things like the ballot initiatives can be important, including, of course, this 92. Now, was that legalization of marijuana or decriminalization?
91 is actually the decriminalization and legalization of marijuana. It's the legalization of recreational marijuana. So Washington and Colorado did it first. Now Oregon's the third, and D.C. is the fourth.
Well, there you go. Steps in the right direction for personal liberty, and as you say, the industrial hemp angle on this, exceptionally important, because of course this is one of the reasons that marijuana has been outlawed for so long, because it does cut into a lot of industrial activities that otherwise get a boon because hemp is outlawed. So that is important. We will keep our eye on that, obviously, and congratulations to the people of Oregon joining the hippie states. All right, but on that note, I got an interesting email in from a listener, Steve, who notes that in Florida you have a couple of interesting stories. For example, one from the Orlando Weekly. Las Vegas casino owner Sheldon Adelson is bankrolling Florida campaign against medical marijuana, which is interesting to contrast with the New York Daily News article from last year. Sheldon Adelson's Sands Casino to pay $47 million fine for failing to report deposits from alleged drug trafficker. So we have a drug money launderer helping to bankroll the measure against medical marijuana in Florida. I wonder why. Is it because that represents the big cut into the profits of the people who stand to benefit from the outlawing, the criminalization of the use of these chemicals and drugs? Yes, of course. So this is good. Again, it's a step in the right direction and helps to break the monopoly. Of course, now we have to work towards decriminalization of other drugs, not for the purpose of spreading them or hoping that people will get addicted to them, but so that we can treat people who are addicted to them as addicts rather than convicts, and stop putting our money in the hands of the Cocaine Importation Agency, the CIA, which has monopolized the running of drugs into the country. So again, this is a step in the right direction, but overall, Republicrats, Democrats, who gives a flying something or other? I certainly don't.
Bush, Clinton, 2016, woohoo!
Yeah.
James, let's look internationally for our second story this week as Israeli ministers pass bill jailing stone throwers for 20 years. We grabbed this from RT. Government ministers in Israel have voted to increase penalties tenfold on people convicted of throwing stones at vehicles from 2 to 20 years. This is a move designed to deal with a wave of violence that's hit some of Jerusalem's Arab districts. If Israeli courts can prove that someone threw a stone with the intent of causing serious bodily harm, they get to impose this new 20-year sentence. The law would also allow the conviction of people who hurl rocks at police cars or police officers with the aim of hindering them from carrying out their duty. If intent to cause harm can't be proven, then the amendments still allow for 10-year sentence, a hefty 10-year sentence, if the safety of a person or a vehicle is endangered. At the moment, such crimes have a maximum penalty of 2 years. A new policy that's been in place since July and applies to minors as well as adults means that Palestinians are being held in custody from the time they are arrested until the end of proceedings. That kind of sounds like indefinite detention to me. There are also minor clashes in the West Bank after last Friday's prayers. However, the West Bank would not be subject to this new legislation, as it's effectively ruled by the Israeli military. James, there are other bits to throw back in this, and actually a fascinating investigation from Al Jazeera. But I'll close out the segment with that, because I want to throw this back to you as we're basically kind of talking about Israeli terror versus Palestinian terror.
Well, that's exactly the point. And again, you look at this 20 years for throwing stones at police officers in Jerusalem, but contrast that with a recent report that just came out, was covered by The Independent, saying that the airstrikes on Gaza could be war crimes. Gee, do you think 1,523 civilians, 2,192 Palestinians overall dead in that reign of terror that we saw earlier this summer, and there could have been war crimes in there? Do you think? The targeting of civilians and civilian populations, that was, again, I mean, it just goes to show the contrast between the two sides here, and it's a bit like saying, well, that man came after me with a fluffy pillow, I better shoot him between the eyes. So, and again, the double standards continue, because, of course, the Zionist side of this always considers Israeli life to be worth more than Palestinian life, period, end of story. And this is seen time and time and time and time and time again, but some recent examples of that phenomenon. There's a Reddit's conspiracy subreddit post about world news on Reddit. The World News subreddit removed a submission about 11-year-old disabled Palestinian being blindfolded and detained by the IDF in Palestine because they don't allow local crime stories. Yeah, and, well, of course, that's not really news. But contrast that to something like the BBC covering breathlessly this new Jerusalem attack of a Palestinian targeting an Israeli by running him over with a white van, and this is the newest wave of terror, which they happen to note halfway down the story is due to the fact that the Israelis are cracking down once again on access to the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound and increasing settlement expansion, which is why Jordan is now pulling their ambassador from Tel Aviv. And contrast that, for example, with a story that just happened a couple of weeks ago that you can find on the Middle East Monitor, but you will never see on BBC News. Jewish settler runs over 2 Palestinian children in the West Bank, killing 1. So again, if a Jewish a settler does it to a Palestinian child, who cares? If an Israeli gets killed by a Palestinian, though, major international story must be covered by the BBC. Unfortunately, these double standards continue. And on the note of Israeli terror, that brings up the related story that you were going to talk about from the Al Jazeera report.
Al Jazeera investigation, Israel knowingly attacked U.S. military ship in 1967. James, a lot of folks out there are probably, or they're not, should be familiar with the story of the USS Liberty. For folks of us who have been involved in alternative media, this is one of the sort of the bedrock stories that sort of exposes a lot of the official story of this entire sort of world and shell game that we're told about. What's fascinating about this, they have a new documentary called The Day Israel Attacked America. It is up on YouTube. I don't know if it'll stay there forever, so grab that link and grab the video down. 2 parts make this interesting, James. They have 2 exclusive bits. They've got new audio tapes from Israeli jets proving Israel identified the USS Liberty as an American ship before they attacked it. And the second one, it's the first revelation of a network of pro-Israel agents inside LBJ's administration, identified in declassified Israeli documents by their code names, who fed secret info back to Jerusalem and worked to sway LBJ to cover up the attack on the Liberty. And that would be another mission accomplished. James?
Unfortunately so. Again, this is not surprising. I think we all knew all of this already, but it's good to have the confirmation and the declassified documents and the actual audio of the tapes so that we can finally lay this to rest. Yes, that was an Israeli terror attack on the United States that was covered up by agents within the LBJ administration. Case closed. Another case of Israel terror being covered up by America.
Now, for our third and final story this week, James, let's turn to an op-ed piece, I suppose if we could call it that, originally published in the Financial Times, ft.com, which has a pretty hefty paywall. And again, I would always implore folks out there, save articles, screen grab, do what you got to do, because you never know when things are going to be removed. Is the new GCHQ boss afraid of the World Wide Web? His name's Robert Hannigan, and the op-ed he wrote, James, is called "The Web is a Terrorist Command and Control Network of Choice." In a lot of ways, shining more light than perhaps they mean to. But he writes, "The Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, ISIS, is the first terrorist group whose members have grown up on the internet. They're exploiting the power of the web to create a jihadi threat with near global reach. The challenge to governments and their intel agencies is huge, and it can only be met with greater cooperation from technology companies. Terrorists have long made use of the internet, but ISIS's approach is different in 2 important areas. Where Al-Qaeda and its affiliates saw the internet as a place to disseminate material anonymously or meet in dark spaces, ISIS has embraced the web as a noisy channel in which to promote itself, intimidate people, and radicalize new recruits. To those of us who have to tackle the depressing end of human behavior on the internet, it can seem that some technology companies are in denial about its misuse. I suspect most ordinary users of the internet are ahead of them, the IT companies. Ordinary users have strong views on the ethics of companies, whether on taxation, child protection, or privacy. They do not want the media platforms they use with their friends and family to facilitate murder and child abuse. I think those customers would be comfortable with a better, more sustainable relationship between the agencies and the technology companies. As we celebrate the 25th anniversary of the spectacular creation that is the World Wide Web, we need a new deal between democratic governments and the technology companies in the area of protecting our citizens. It should be a deal rooted in the democratic values we share. That means addressing some uncomfortable truths. Better to do it now than in the aftermath of greater violence." That's how he ends his op-ed, to basically say, almost with a wink, a nod, a threat, there's going to be greater violence, at which point we will shove draconian new laws down your throat. So you can just acquiesce and give a little bit up now, or pick it later. That seems to be what he's saying, James.
That's pretty much it. And again, just to clarify for people who didn't catch it, this is the head of GCHQ, the British NSA. So once again, it is the cyber terrorist speaking to us. This is the person who holds the gun to the head of the internet as we've known it and wants to clamp down even more, because that's ultimately the agenda. And this is just part of a trail of clues that have laid it out for anyone who was oblivious to this fact, that the long-term agenda is to turn the internet into a completely controlled system where you have to thumb scan or whatever it is to get access, and there's not going to be any pretense of anonymity anymore. Even if there was really not much chance of that before, there's going to be really no chance of it in the future. And the vision of the internet that they want to bring into view is one that is, again, completely controlled. What you can post, where you can post it, on pre-approved sites or something like a YouTube type system, where if they don't like what you say, they take your content down and there's nothing you can do about it. So that's the vision of the future of the web. I'm going to actually write an article for my subscriber newsletter this weekend connecting some of those dots. So once again, if you'd like to subscribe to the Corbett Report, you can get that newsletter, and I'll put in all the links to all the various stories, all the cookie crumbs leading down this trail towards the future of the web, which is a dark future, again, unless we fight for this. And what's the best way to fight for it? Again, build up the alternative infrastructure, the pirate internet that we've talked about here and that I've covered on my podcast.
James, in closing on this episode 211, New World Next Week, let's quickly glance at some of the New World Next Week updates that some of our fine friends use on Twitter, hashtag New World Next Week. And it's our usual awesome suspects of Brock West and GJ Salisbury and also David Ewert 4. But James, as I come to you right now, it is still, remember the 5th of November, anonymous protest in London on Bonfire Night, as the latest I've seen, even from RT, tense Guy Fawkes Day standoff between Million Mask March protesters and police in London. So that's presently going on. Some of the other things we're looking at: number of global billionaires has doubled since the financial crisis. That's coming from The Independent. Secret file on establishment pedophiles may be open as part of UK inquiry. Trilateral Commission had a sneaky quiet meeting in Serbia. And Facebook admits government requests for user data has gone up 24% in just the last 6 months. James, that's just some of the stuff we try and track for you on New World Next Week, and again, using our own sites and using hashtag New World Next Week to try and keep up with as much as we can and do it open source for everybody.
That's right. And speaking of 5th of November and Guy Fawkes Day, I find it quite ironic that most people today only know Guy Fawkes from V for Vendetta and don't really know anything about that history. But when you look into it, it was actually a false flag event, puppeteered by Robert Cecil. So I did talk about that, in fact, in a recent interview with The Last Defense. I'll put that in the show notes so you can go and listen to that interview. And I think that's it for us this week. James, thanks again for your stories.
Thanks so much, man.
Well, what about the Libertarian Party? Can you tell us a little bit about what it stands for?
Libertarian Party is based on a firm principle of non-aggression. We all take a pledge when we join the party that we will never initiate force against somebody else. And that is, a pretty simple principle that everybody should endorse. It's a principle of what makes civilization. That is, you respect other people's life, and you respect other people's property. Thou shalt not steal, and thou shalt not murder. It's that simple, and most everybody agrees to that. And the next question ought to be is, well, why should you be different than Republicans and Democrats if they tend to agree with that same principle? Well, we believe it's such an important moral principle that if we can't take somebody else's property and we can't hurt anybody or we can't intimidate anybody or threaten to use force, we don't think the government can either. But we see the government as the initiator of force to bring about social and economic changes day in and day out. I mean, they may not come up to our front door with a gun, and occasionally they do. But we know if we don't deliver our money and our records and do obediently what the government wants in order to give up our portion of our income through the Internal Revenue Service, the gun will be quickly at our door and we will be in prison. So it's the threat and the intimidation, and therefore they're transferring wealth, something that we can't do as individuals. So we as libertarians reject this whole idea of forcible redistribution of wealth, which is the welfare state. Same way in personal liberties. We apply this principle in the area of personal liberties, and although I might want you and think you should lead a certain lifestyle because I think it's good and right and moral, I have no right to tell you what to do. You know, if you want to live a certain way, and I disagree, that's tough. You know, that's your choosing. That's the individual's choice, as long as you don't hurt somebody else. So the person has the right to his own life and his liberty, his own lifestyle, as with one special rule, that your lifestyle, the individual's lifestyle, can't hurt somebody else. So if you do things that I disapprove of, I, as a libertarian, am tolerant, and I accept that up until the point of no injury to anybody else.
Now, I talk to libertarians or listen to them or view them on TV, and they're talking about government power all the time and abuse of governmental power. But I also see some libertarians, not a whole lot of them, but a lot of them also talk about corporate power as well. In other words, they're talking about power in general. There seem to be two types of libertarians.
Well, I think we have one type of libertarian because we all accept the same principle. I think it's more easily found that you have several types of Republicans and several types of Democrats because they're interventionists and they can intervene any way they want. But I think libertarians are pretty consistent in certainly condemning the power of government. I haven't heard a libertarian saying that we need more government or they're not a libertarian. But on the corporate power, I think where the confusion might come is corporate size, if it's gained by serving the consumer, is not necessarily evil. So if you have 90% of the car industry, and for some miraculous reason or for some unknown reason there's no imports, if you have 90% of it, that doesn't bother me as a libertarian if you have the best car at the best price and the consumers are very happy. Now, if you have 90% or 100% of a utility company and you're gouging the customers and the customers have no place else to go, we detest the corporate size. We detest corporate power when it's gained through government power, you know, government coercion. If it's a contract, the military-industrial complex is a pretty good example of how large industries benefit by big government. Of course, in banking, big banks benefit by this monetary system because they're sort of in collusion with the Federal Reserve System, so we detest that. We detest bigness and we detest corporate power when it's gained through privilege from government. If corporations are large, and there's always free entry in a free market, if they're large because they serve the consumer, we don't worry too much about that because we know the consumer is benefiting. If they get to the point, if they had 100% of an industry, which is not possible in a free market, but let's say, just for instance, if they had 100%, and then they started to gouge the people, there would immediately be competition. There always has to be free entry and free competition. But nobody's ever figured out where there's ever been a true monopoly in a free market system. All monopolies can be traced to some form of government protectionism.
Well, of course, now we talk about government and corporations. But as you've said, up at the top, they're all the same people. The corporate executives go to and from the government. They hold positions in the government. The people from the Trilateral Commission and the Bilderbergers and all, they're all corporate people. And they have their relationships and interlocks with the banks and with universities and foundations and all that. So to talk about you're really talking about one source of power instead of corporation on one side and government on the other, because it's all one pot, as you said.
I think it's become one pot. Not only that is you don't have any help by, say, voting for a Democrat who may be a little more critical of large corporations. But we know Democrats are just as much in bed with big government too. I mean, you take a Michael Dukakis, for instance. Do you think maybe Boston was somewhat dependent on some military contracts with Tip O'Neill? I mean, they're just as much. It's all demagoguery when it comes to these political campaigns. So either side, the same people control it. And, you know, Ronald Reagan spoke sharply against the Trilateral Commission, but he was the first president to host the Trilateral Commission in the White House. I mean, that's how blatant it is. It's the same group of people. That's why you find no political action committee, no large corporation who supports libertarians. I voted while in Congress. I think the strictest free market set of votes ever, but I never got political action committee money. But small business people who want to compete against big business, they're free market people, and they're much more likely to be libertarians and believe in the principles of free enterprise. But once the corporations get real large, And they're more interested in paying a couple $100,000 for a top lobbyist who knows the system, who can get a regulation that exempts their corporation or gets their contract in place. And this is the way the system works. So we reward the lobbyists and the political action committees much more so than we reward a principle of freedom.
What about this Banking and Currency Committee? And we've had Congressman Gonzalez on, who's one of your colleagues, and he sees the world very clearly and sees the power structures at work. And I'm sure you have a clear picture of this also. Is this one of the reasons you became a libertarian instead of a Republican?
Well, it's certainly one of the reasons why I got involved in politics, because I was very fascinated with economics and particularly monetary policy. And if you think about it, money is pretty important. If you look at all transactions, whether you're buying something or selling your services, 1/2 of all economic transactions is the monetary unit. So if somebody has control over the value of the monetary unit, they control every transaction. Therefore, if you have an institution, such as a government-ordained bank, like a central bank, like our Federal Reserve, if they have absolute monopoly control over the value of that currency, they control everything in the economy. It becomes a form of a government-regulated economy. It doesn't become socialism, but the money obviously is socialistic in that the government controls it. So if they increase the supply, the value goes down. If they tighten the supply, interest rates go up. So it's tremendous economic power. And the insiders, those who know what the policy is, literally can benefit. They don't stuff their pockets and line their pockets with cash. That's not the way it happens. But those who are in the inside and knowledgeable will benefit because they know which direction interest rates are going and which way the economy is going. And if you look at the members of the Federal Reserve, you find out that they don't ask people like me to be on the Federal Reserve, even though I've had experience on studying the issue and been on the banking committee. They ask only the people who are casually referred to as the insiders, those from Wall Street and the banking industry, the Paul Volckers and the Alan Greenspans of the world. They're on the inside. They know how to deal with the establishment, and they get these positions, and therefore it is a tremendous amount of economic power falls into the hands of what we call the Open Market Committee, the Federal Open Market Committee. They control from day to day the supply of money. They become the legal counterfeiters. You know, if you and I had control of the printing press, we could do a lot of things, you know, self-serving. That's what happens when the politicians create the central bank that control the money.
Now, this control of the central bank and the money goes on regardless of which party is in power, right?
It never changes. You know, they change a person here and there, but it's always the insiders. It's always from the same group. So if you have a Republican as president or the Democrats, they're going to get the same appointments. Appointments never change. And this can be said about the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of Treasury and the Federal Reserve Board members. They all come from the same group. And even though, I guess naively, I was hopeful that the same group of individuals would not have as much power under Ronald Reagan. But, you know, I was there, I witnessed it, and of course that led to my disenchantment, my disappointment, enough to the point where I just said, I've had enough, and then I left the Republican Party and joined the Libertarian Party with the idea that you cannot trust Republicans to be independent of the system either, although Ronald Reagan led us to believe that he would be independent.
You, as a free, beautiful, independent human being with inalienable rights, own yourself. As a result, you can do what you want with your own body and own the product of your labor. The implication is that it is morally wrong to initiate force against someone else or their property, because to do so is to violate their rights. Therefore, all human interactions should be free of force, fraud, and coercion, and people should be free to exercise their rights, limited only by respect for the rights of others. When you learned don't hit and don't steal, it wasn't unless you work for the government. When you learned thou shalt not kill, it wasn't unless your dear leader gives you a gun and a uniform and a one-way ticket to the other side of the world. Government is force, an opinion with a gun, and force is a poor substitute for persuasion. Governments frighten us into thinking we need them, but with knowledge, philosophy, and technology, we are empowering ourselves and each other to have the courage to move past the paradigm of statism and restrain government to only moral uses of force, at least until we replace it with the cooperative, free market solutions that will soon render it obsolete.
You sick agenda, we know you American, you come forward American Constitution. 1913, corrupting the system, devalue dollar, hyperinflation, the Federal Reserve, controlled by Lucifer. He can see you lying in your eyes. Bye. You know can hide from Judge Jesus Christ. Hallelujah. No